We were not prepared to pay compensation for land that was seized from us without any purchase price being paid to our ancestors. So it was the obligation of the British to find money and compensate their kith and kin who were owners, legal owners of our land. We refused completely to carry that burden. America was prepared to fund the land reform program. And if our funds and those of Britain were put together, you would have an adequate fund. That is what happened at Lancaster, and this is how the deadlock was broken. Naturally, of course, nothing was written in detail about what had transpired, but we took for granted that everyone was a gentleman, and what they had said would be realized in practice. And that's how we proceeded. You see, this is how the British do it. Sly and cunning and undependable in the extreme. Well, unfortunately, Carter lost the election that followed a year or two afterwards, after Lancaster, and in came Reagan. And Reagan was a strict character, rigid, didn't know very much. In a sense, he was quite an ignorant president, one of the most ignorant presidents America has had. Because each time he spoke to you, and I happened to have been invited by him, you know, unless he had got the information on his cards in advance, and he could read the card and answer you. His people would say, oh no, he cannot answer that question, and so on and so forth. And he was playing cards, you know, in discussing with you, and I've joked about it and saying, you don't want to discuss with a man who's playing cards.
A lot of people ask the question, why exactly did Zimbabwe fall? A country that was regarded once as a food basket of the nation, and even its former dictator, Robert Mugabe, was once hailed as an icon across Africa. The West praised him, and he increased the standard of living and infrastructural development in his country. But what made all these things to suddenly become the opposite of what is today? Well, let's dive deeper. For us to understand the failure of Zimbabwe, some people just say, oh, it's because the white people were chased out of Zimbabwe and all of that. But that's not entirely true. Let's go deeper first of all. Let's look at the history of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had a great history, and it had history of various forms of settled civilizations. So while a large majority of them were sedentary, some were also nomadic. But again, for the cause of the nomadic lifestyle, some of it was caused by the Mfenkani. That is when Shaka Zulu began attacking different societies around him, and it caused a mass migration. So not all of them were migratory at the beginning. Some of them were already sedentary for hundreds and even thousands of years. But for Zimbabwe's case, they had civilizations like Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, Mutapa states, Torwa or the Butwa states, Rosvi Empire, Ndebele Kingdom, Kami, and many others. These are the most prominent ones. The economy of these various nations thrived on gold mining, iron smelting, livestock, and trading with Swahili merchants along the Swahili coast. And there are evidence that these various civilizations that existed in modern-day Zimbabwe traded with ancient Persia and even ancient China. Now, pre-colonial Zimbabwe was sophisticated and agro-pastoralist, and they maintained a highly organized sedentary lifestyle, debunking the myth that they were solely nomadic herders. Now, while cattle served as a vital symbol of wealth, the population relied heavily on the cultivation of indigenous drought-resistant grains like sorghum, millet, and supported by advanced engineering projects such as Nyanga terraces and intricate irrigation furrows. This integrated mixed farming system, which utilized livestock manure to fertilize permanent crop plots, was essential for sustaining large urban centers like Great Zimbabwe. And evidence of these stone-walled terraces and archaeobotanical remains proved that long before colonization, these societies had mastered complex soil conservation and water management techniques to support a stable agrarian economy. Although overgrazing was a problem because Zimbabwe had a diverse landscape and some parts were more prone to drought and leaching of the soil, especially due to their heavy grazing. However, they were still able to manage these economies based on what they had around them at the time. Now, for us to also understand what led Zimbabwe to some modern predicament, we need to also understand one more thing, and that is the various African countries that have one of the best soils in the world. Number one, we have Kenya. Number two, we have Rwanda, we have Burundi, we have Nigeria, Uganda, Ivory Coast, Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Now, these countries I just mentioned, some of them are lying between two major belts. One of them is along what I call the Fertile Sahara, and the other along the Great Rift Valley. Now, for the countries along the Great Rift Valley, we have countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Egypt, and Sudan. Now, for those along the Fertile Sahara, we have Nigeria, we have Ivory Coast as well. Now, why did I call this the Fertile Sahara? The Fertile Sahara has one of the best soils because the Sahara itself is a form of natural fertilizer, and in fact, just little dust of it that gets blown by the trade winds from Africa to the Americas actually helps to improve the soil quality of American farmers. So, some African countries that lie chiefly within the Sahara, they have this very fertile soil, but they don't have adequate water to maintain a sustainable agricultural practice. That is why countries like Nigeria and Ivory Coast, that is situated adequately beneath the Sahara and also around the region where they will have adequate rainfall, has enough fertilized or fertile ground for sustainable agriculture. Now, for the countries along the Great Rift Valley, these regions has a kind of geologically active zone. So the soil is almost constantly shifting and moving, thereby exposing the deeper layers of maybe rich soil for agricultural practices. And they even have very active volcanoes along the side. Some of them are dormant now, like even the Mount Kilimanjaro is a dormant volcano actually. So along that line, they have fertile soil. But for Zimbabwe and South Africa, they lie out of these two zones. They are just within the southern edge of Africa. But they have the good soils, one of the best soils in the world. So that will take us to the next chapter, which is how Europeans began fighting for these rich soils. But before that, let's look at one iconic figure, Robert Mugabe. Now, Robert Mugabe led the Zimbabwe African National Union, also known as ZANU, which was a major resistance and liberation group that fought against white minority rule in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. During the 1960s and 1970s, Robert Mugabe primarily led the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, later rephrased itself into ZANU-PF from ZANU. From its formation in 1980 until he was ousted in 2017, he was leader of the original ZANU party, starting in 1975. We later merged with ZAPU to form ZANU-PF, maintaining dominance and often one-party rule, which was seen as leaning towards socialism, and it caused the country a lot of troubles during the Cold War era because that kind of style of government made them feel that they are not democratic enough, and it even pushed Zimbabwe closer to the Soviet Union. And that's also one of the reasons because African countries that practiced some kind of socialism during the Cold War era suffered a lot. Countries like Zimbabwe, of course, countries like Guinea, countries like Ethiopia, and many others. Nigeria, you had a few socialist thinkers, but they were not really enforcing that into political landscape. Nigeria was one of the few countries that was somewhat pro-capitalist or adopted a mixed economic system of both socialism and capitalism. Now, Robert Mugabe is famous for doing many things in his country. At the beginning of his leadership, he improved standard of living, improved education in his country, and he was praised across the world as an icon of an African leader. But there's something that he did later on that made him famous or infamous, depending on what you see. Now, he began to redistribute land. And this is a very controversial topic because at first, who owned the land? The land was previously owned by native people of Zimbabwe, and their land ownership system was more of communal ownership, where the community or the king himself owned the land, and the land was given to whoever wanted to farm. You needed a farm land, you go and meet the king, and the king allocated land for you. And for some Africans, they saw this as some kind of native socialism, because socialism says yes, the means of production is in the hands of the government, right? Or so communism is in the hands of the people. So some Africans that practice this, in fact in Nigeria we have the Hausa people, some of them also practice this as well, where the land is owned by the emir or the shehu or the mai, and then whoever needs a farmland will meet the king, and the king will allocate land for you. In the Igbo society, it's more of a republic where each man owns his own land, acres of land. And in fact, there is a common joke in Nigeria that an average Igbo man will have acres of land big enough to build an estate, but he will just build one tiny house and build trees all around him. That was how the traditional Igbos lived. In my own society, as well, the Idoma and the Yala, it was quite similar to the Igbos, but it was like a merger between the Igbos and the Hausa system. Everyone had their own land. They even had maybe a land in the main town where the people lived, and the land in the outskirts of the town, which were called Woleeche. Woleeche means like the outside house. Then we have Ipuole. Ipuole means like inside the house or inside the town. So we had the main town itself, just called Ipuole, and we had the outskirts, just called Woleeche. So people had their own houses within the town and maybe small gardens there, but they also had large acres of land where they farmed rice, guinea corn, millets, and other crops of economic importance to them. So when Mugabe came into power and began to rally for land reforms, at first it began to take long, but then sometimes became fed up with it and began to chase out. Not really chasing out, but then he began to support the native who were pushing out the white settlers, and then the rest is history. Now, for us to understand the implications of what he did at the time, we need to look at the Soviet Union, particularly the region now known as Kazakhstan. Now, in the early 20th century, the Soviet Union began to force nomadic herders who have herded cattle and camels all of their life for thousands of years. They began forcing them to settle down and live in communal farms, and this completely devastated the population of the people. This is known as Ashashelik. I don't know if I pronounce this properly, but this Ashashelik was a series of turmoil, mostly drought, famine, starvation, and even cannibalism. There were cases where a train is moving maybe past a town, and if it stops at the particular train station because of how hungry people were, they would easily drag anyone who is exposed, maybe sitting close to a doorway. They would drag you and pieces you and even kill you and eat you. That was how terrible it was, because these people have never farmed. They were not professional farmers. If you gave them more cattle to head, they would have been more productive, but forcing them to farm crops which they had never done before, or they didn't do at a large scale, was a recipe for disaster. Now, for the case of Zimbabwe, it wasn't this chaotic. However, it led to a similar problem, not as large as cannibalism, but a problem of starvation. Back to how Europeans got the land in the first place, we need to look deeper into the 19th century. The first Europeans to try and settle in the modern Zimbabwe were the Portuguese, and this one dates back to as much as the 16th century, or the 1600s rather. However, the Roosevelt Empire did not allow that dream to come true, as they enacted policies to halt such attempts. However, in 1889, Cecil Rhodes and the British South Africa Company, BSAC, introduced the earliest white settler to Zimbabwe as prospectors, seeking concessions from the Bele for mining rights. Collectively known as the Pioneer Column, the settlers established the city of Salisbury, now Harare. Rhodes hoped to discover gold and establish a mining colony, but the original intention had to be modified, as neither the costs nor the returns on the overhead capital matched the original projections. Local gold deposits failed to yield the massive returns which the BSAC had promised its investors, and the military cost of the expedition had caused a deficit. An interim solution was the granting of land to the settlers in the hope that they would develop productive farms and generate enough income to justify the colony's continued administrative costs. The region was demarcated as Southern Rhodesia after 1889. So you can see that at the beginning it was just let's go and mine for some gold, and when the gold they found wasn't really substantial, because Zimbabwe has more of, I think, copper and some other minerals, also might discuss later in this video, the prospect for finding gold became a kind of a moonshine. So they decided to compensate them with land. So you can see how it was. Between 1890 and 1896, the BSAC granted an area encompassing 16 million acres, about 1/6 the area of Southern Rhodesia, to European migrants. By 1913, this had been extended to 21.5 million acres. And then during the Ndebele and Shona insurrections against the BSAC in the mid-1890s, when land was promised to any European willing to take up arms in defense of the colony, irrespective of their financial status, the settlers of the pioneer column were granted tracts of 3,150 acres apiece per person, 3,150 acres for one person, with an option to purchase more land from the BSAC's holding at relatively low price, up to 15 times cheaper than the comparable land on the market in South Africa. Now, back to the modern world, when Robert Mugabe began seizing land from white settlers, because at first they tried to make it a bit more amiable, and then the Americans began to maybe subsidize it and fund it, and even the British first. But I think after 10 years, the British left the deal to help resettle black people on the farmland, or on the land which was dispossessed from them about a century earlier. Now, this led to sanctions and boycotts, I would say. Now, the US used ZDERA, which instructed US representatives at international financial institutions to oppose debt cancellation for Zimbabwe, new IMF lending, and World Bank loans. African Development Bank support was also restricted to Zimbabwe at this time, and even broader financial support was restricted until they saw relevant government reforms. The law also linked normalization to conditions such as restoring rule of law, holding free and fair elections, military neutrality, and compensation for expropriated farms. Now, why this mattered? Because Zimbabwe was already struggling economically. Losing access to international credit markets made recovery much harder. Critics of sanctions argue ZDERA became devastating because Zimbabwe could no longer easily restructure debts. Foreign investors became afraid of risk. Banks avoided Zimbabwe, and international financial isolation deepened. And it didn't take long before hyperinflation kicked in. Zimbabwe experienced one of the worst hyperinflation crises in modern history. At its peak around 2008, prices changed daily. Imagine buying something today and then tomorrow the price has gone high. Savings became worthless because the currency lost its value, and $1 trillion Zimbabwe banknotes appeared to help manage the inflation. It sounded like Germany in the early 1900s with the Great Repression, or it is the Great Depression, when $1 million, or is it million euros, whatever, the banknote began to appear in Germany because of hyperinflation. The situation became so dire that the government began acting desperate in a bid to attract foreign investors. Under Robert Mugabe and later Emerson Mnangagwa, the government increasingly offered access to major mineral resources to foreign investors in exchange for loans, infrastructural projects, diplomatic support, and investments. The most discussed minerals included platinum, gold, diamonds, lithium, chrome, coal, and nickel. China became the largest foreign partner. As Western financing and relations deteriorated after sanctions and debt problems, Zimbabwe adopted its Look East policy, turning heavily toward China. Chinese companies received major mining concessions and infrastructural deals, including platinum mines, lithium extraction, coal projects, and diamond fields. For example, lithium became especially important recently. Zimbabwe has one of Africa's largest lithium reserves, which became strategically valuable because lithium is used in electric vehicles via battery. However, opposition groups and some economists accuse the government of trading strategic national resources for short-term survival, especially during periods of hyperinflation, sanctions, and debt distress. At the same time, the government argued this partnership were necessary because Western lenders and investors had largely withdrawn. At the end of the day, They say the end shall justify the means. Robert was once seen and hailed as a good guy, a man who built infrastructure of his nation, increased education rates and productivity, but also he's known as the man who destroyed a nation. But the problem is that most politicians in Africans aren't even professional politicians, and they don't even hold a degree in any social science course, which would be very relevant for them in terms of government or leadership. But then we see that we live in a lopsided world where justice is somewhat injustice. Most times sanctions are placed on people based on their nationality. For example, when Haiti deposed the French in their rebellions, it was the Haitians who were forced to pay reparation to the French people. But black people will never be paid reparation, be it in Africa or in the Americas. Black Americans have been fighting to get reparations for years, and the fights have gone on deaf ears. In Africa, when Zimbabwe chased out the white farmers and seized their land, the black people were never given reparation for their land being seized or for their resources being extracted without their consent. But again, what is democracy, and who defines what democracy is? We live in a world where justice is relative, not objective. I hope Zimbabwe has a greater future, and I hope the world becomes a better place. Thank you for watching this video.